By the time I reached the private dining room in Buckhead, I was already rehearsing whatever serious conversation Evan thought deserved candles, linen napkins, and a reservation with my name attached. Then I stepped inside and saw Jenna first, Caleb second, and Sabrina at the far end of the table in a pale silk blouse I had once watched Evan smooth from a garment bag. Nobody looked surprised to see me, which was how I knew I was the only person who had walked in without the script. Evan stood, kissed my cheek like we were still us, and said, "There she is." Like I was late to my own humiliation instead of exactly on time. I sat down because leaving that fast would have given them the scene they were already arranging for me, and I could feel it in the way Caleb kept smiling before anything happened. Sabrina barely glanced up from her wine, but her coat was draped over the empty chair beside Evan, and that one detail told me more than any confession would have. The waiter poured water. Menus were closed, and conversation started in that polished tone people use when they want cruelty to pass for atmosphere instead of intention. Evan kept tossing out neat little cuts about my routines, my spreadsheets, my need to plan everything, and Jenna laughed too quickly each time, like she already knew the rhythm. When Caleb said some people confuse stability with a personality, and Sabrina looked down into her glass to hide a smile, the whole room finally stopped pretending. I looked at Evan and asked, quietly enough that nobody could call me dramatic, why he had brought me here if all he wanted was an audience. He leaned back, glanced once toward Sabrina, and told me not every room was built for people who needed everything to feel safe before they could belong. I asked for the check to be split, paid for my meal, left the tip I would have left on any other night, then stood with my purse in my hand and told him I was done. I drove straight to Noah's condo with my receipt still folded in my purse and the taste of wine and humiliation sitting at the back of my throat. He opened the door, took one look at my face, stepped aside, and let me in without asking the kind of questions people use to make pain perform. I took the blanket he handed me, sat on his couch, and stared at the wall long enough to understand that what happened in that room had not been spontaneous. Evan called the next night a little after 11, already breaking apart, and the first thing he gave me was not remorse but outrage over how embarrassed he felt. I let him talk because men like him usually reveal the truth by the order in which they defend themselves, and his own humiliation came before my name. When he pushed out, "You really just walked out like that." I looked at the phone in my hand and understood he still thought the worst thing that happened was losing control of the ending. I told him he had mocked me in front of an audience. He assembled himself, and he tried to sand it down by calling it a joke that got away. Then he made it worse by insisting nothing had happened before dinner, which would have sounded cleaner if I had not seen Sabrina seated there like somebody already expected. By the time he reached for the lease and reminded me there were 3 months left, I was calmer than he was, and that seemed to unsettle him most. The next morning I went back while he was at work and packed without rushing, taking my clothes, my books, my laptop, and every small thing I had bought myself. In the kitchen I found the private dining room confirmation still open, with the deposit tied to payment information I had once trusted him to use for shared expenses. I took the screenshot, sent it to myself, and kept moving, because that one charge told me the dinner had been arranged well before I walked in. When I got back to Noah's place, he read everything and kept me inside the narrow lane that would matter later, which meant no speeches, no spiraling, no messy texts. I left a note on the counter that my half of the lease would be paid through the end date, that future contact could stay limited to logistics, and that everything else was over. Then I set my key beside the note, closed the door behind me, and walked out knowing I was not leaving blind, only leaving before he could take more. About 2 weeks later, Jenna texted me just after lunch with a message so flat it almost looked accidental, asking if I had a minute because there was something I should probably see. I stared at her name longer than I needed to, then answered that she could send whatever she had, and the typing bubble appeared, vanished, then came back twice. When the screenshots finally landed, I knew before opening the first one that nobody reaches out like that unless a story has already started cracking somewhere else. It was a group chat I had never seen, ordinary enough to make it worse, with months of messages that turned my relationship into background entertainment before Evan ever finished ending it. At first, it was the same language he used in public. That I was too structured, too careful, too predictable. But in writing it looked colder because repetition always does. Then, Sabrina entered the thread early, not as a surprise guest to a mess she stumbled into, but as someone already shaping tone, timing, and how small I was supposed to feel when the room closed around me. Jenna had not sent commentary or excuses, just image after image. And the absence of explanation made the evidence hit harder because nothing needed translating. Caleb joked that all Evan had to do was let me hear enough of the truth sideways and I would remove myself for him. And nobody in that thread pushed back. Sabrina wrote that a private room would keep things contained if I reacted badly. And Evan answered that if I walked out on my own, the whole thing would be cleaner and nobody would have to play the villain out loud. I read every line twice, because betrayal always looks different once it stops being a feeling and becomes a document with timestamps and casual punctuation. The worst part was not that they expected me to be hurt, but that they had rehearsed the shape of my humiliation so carefully that my dignity had been factored in as a convenience. By the time I reached the message where Evan wrote that I kept mistaking stability for belonging, I could hear his voice from the restaurant and understand that none of it had been improvised. I forwarded the screenshots to myself, backed them up, and sent everything to Noah without adding a single emotional sentence he would later have to peel away from the facts. Jenna followed with one last text that read, "I know this doesn't fix anything." And I left it unanswered because repair was not what she had brought me. What she handed me was narrower and more useful than remorse, a record proving that the dinner had not been a collapse, but a performance built in advance, with Evan at the center and Sabrina helping him write it. I did not make speeches after that, because the screenshots had already done the only work emotion could not, which was locking his cruelty to timestamps and names. Noah went through everything with me in order, stripped it down to what mattered, and kept repeating that the cleanest move was the strongest one if I wanted every next step to hold. So I shut down the card access Evan had been using, disputed the dinner deposit that hit payment information he no longer had permission to touch, and saved every confirmation in one folder. Then I separated myself from everything that could be twisted later into a story about abandonment, instability, or unpaid obligations. Because men like him love loose ends they can narrate, I emailed the landlord, confirmed I would keep paying my half of the lease through the end date, removed myself from renters' insurance and utilities where I could, and kept every reply in writing. By the end of that afternoon, my name was no longer floating around his life as a convenience he could keep spending after he was done with me. What changed next was not the truth, because I already had that, but the version of it Evan started trying to circulate once he realized I was not calling, begging, or trying to get back inside his version of events. A mutual contact let it slip that he had been telling people I was emotionally unavailable, that I walked out too easily, that I never knew how to be part of a room unless it was arranged around me. The language was so close to the group chat that I barely reacted, because once you see the rehearsal on screen, the live performance stops sounding original. Caleb made it worse in the lazy, public way people like him always do, tossing out a clipped little post about how some women confuse attention with belonging, then letting others fill in names. I did not answer him, correct him, or give him the argument he was baiting, because the post itself was more useful than anything I could have typed back in anger. I saved the link, took the timestamp, archived the screenshot, and added it to the same record that already held the dinner charge and the private room plan. That was when the first layer of revenge became simple enough to trust, because I was no longer trying to make him understand what he had done. I was cutting off every place where he had been feeding on my access, my stability, and the social ease that came from standing beside someone more solid than he was. He could keep telling people I left too quietly if he wanted. But every quiet thing I did after that removed another piece of infrastructure he had mistaken for his own. A little over a month later, I heard through the same polished Atlanta channels Evan respected more than intimacy that he and Sabrina were expected at a charity preview dinner. It was the kind of room he always treated like proof of arrival. All donors, hospitality names, and people who decided quietly whose ambition looked polished and whose looked dangerous. What he either forgot or preferred to erase was that he had first entered rooms like that through me, because I had once made an introduction he was still spending. That detail mattered more than jealousy ever could, because it turned the whole thing from a personal betrayal into unauthorized use of access, credibility, and social footing he had not built alone. Sabrina needed that dinner too. Not for romance, but for clients, because her event work depended on being seen as discreet, easy to trust, and already welcome where money sat. Once I understood that both of them were still trying to stand on a floor they had helped rip out from under me, the next step stopped feeling emotional. I did not call anyone to gossip. I did not hint online. And I did not ask a single friend to carry the story for me, because that would have made it sound negotiable. Instead, I put together a concise record with the screenshots, the disputed dinner charge, the timing of the private room deposit, Caleb's public post, and the proof that access tied to me was still being converted into value for them. Then I sent it to the guest ethics contact for the event with one clean point: that I was not consenting to my name, my prior introduction, or my financial footprint being used to underwrite either of them. I did not ask for punishment, which was part of why the email worked, because I was not trying to detonate a scandal, only to stop a misuse that had already become documented. The reply came the next afternoon, careful and professional, thanking me for the information and confirming they were reviewing guest placement and host coordination in light of what I sent. 2 hours later, another message reached me through a mutual contact, and this time it carried the only line that mattered. Evan had been asked to step back pending review. Sabrina lost her hosting role the same day, not with a public scene, but with the kind of quiet removal that hits harder in rooms built on reputation. Nobody called me dramatic then, because documents have a way of draining the performance out of people who survive by narrative. And both of them had finally met a record they could not charm. He had wanted me to feel out of place at his table, and in the end, he was the one removed from it, not by my voice, but by the evidence he left behind. After the event review pushed Evan out of the room he had counted on, the rest of it stopped looking like heartbreak and started looking like fallout with names attached. His company did not need a public scandal to pull back from him, because the guest review, the expense questions, and the access issue were already enough to make him expensive. Within weeks, he was no longer the person sent into donor-facing spaces. And in a career built on proximity, that kind of quiet demotion lands harder than shouting. Sabrina took the hit she had earned in the exact place she thought she was climbing. Because discretion is not a small skill in her line of work. It is the whole approach. Once the review reached the right circles, 2 client opportunities went away without drama, and nobody needed to call her immoral for the message to land. She had not just stepped into a relationship that was ending. She had helped design the stage, and people trust you differently after they see that. Jenna tried to live in the narrow space between guilt and self-preservation, which was probably why she sent me the screenshots without asking for anything back. I never answered beyond what was necessary, because truth delivered late is still late, even when it is useful. She lost the group anyway, not because she became honest, but because people like Evan and Sabrina always turn on the witness first, once the performance stops working. Caleb did what men like Caleb always do when the joke acquires paperwork, which was pull his hands back and pretend he had never really been involved. The post came down. The smug little tone disappeared. And so did he. First from the conversation, and then from a few rooms where people had finally decided he was a liability. Nobody formally announced consequences for him, but he had built his value around being welcome. And that kind of Noah stayed exactly what he had been from the beginning, which was useful, steady, and allergic to any move that would turn evidence into theater. He made sure my lease payments stayed clean through the end date. My records stayed organized, and my silence never looked like confusion or weakness. By the time the last payment cleared and the final loose end closed, every person from that dinner had reached the natural edge of what they had chosen, and I was the only one who had not needed to lie, chase, or perform to get there. By the time the lease ended, my life had already stopped orbiting the damage, which mattered more to me than anything that had happened to Evan after the review. My new apartment was smaller than the one we had shared, cleaner in spirit, and quiet in a way that never once asked me to shrink to keep the room comfortable. I went back to the routines he used to mock. The early workouts, the meal prep, the calendar blocks, the evenings that looked ordinary from the outside and felt like peace from the inside. Therapy helped, not because I needed someone to explain that cruelty was cruel, but because I wanted to understand why I had trained myself to excuse erosion while it was still happening. The answers were not dramatic enough for strangers, which was probably why they were true. Because love had made me patient, routine had made me loyal, and familiarity had made me late. Once I stopped treating those qualities like flaws, healing stopped feeling like repair and started feeling like recognition. Somewhere in the middle of all that, I met Daniel through a mutual friend, and the only reason it mattered was that nothing about him required translation. He listened the first time, showed up when he said he would, and never once tried to make steadiness sound small so he could feel larger beside it. I did not rush it or hang a future on it, but I noticed how calm my body stayed around him, and after everything that came before, that kind of ease felt expensive. A few months later, I was invited to a small fundraising dinner after a panel tied to work, and I said yes without wondering whether I belonged in the room. The invitation had come to me directly, under my own name, for my own work, and that detail landed harder than any dramatic speech could have. Halfway through the evening, I saw Evan across the room, thinner, quieter, no longer moving like the air bent around him. And when my phone lit up later with a message asking if we could talk, I let it sit unanswered. That was the part that finally felt like supremacy. Not that he had fallen, but that I no longer needed his version of events to collapse in front of me to trust what I knew. He had tried to remove me from a room by making me feel misplaced, and months later I was standing in a better one without borrowing anyone else's name to get there. Thank you for staying with me through this story, and if any part of it felt familiar, I hope it reminds you that peace is not small, starting over is not failure, and the right love never asks you to become less to keep it.